Hi everyone. The topic for this week is racial bias. One of my favorite topics, and I'm particularly disappointed that we don't get to discuss this in person with each other this year because this topic usually prompts some really good discussion. So I'll be especially interested in getting your thoughts on the discussion board this week. In the lecture today, we're going to kind of do this in three parts. First, we'll talk about racial bias in general and what the psychological research on racial bias says and what some of the consequences of racial bias are. We'll then talk specifically about racial bias in the justice system, and then we will conclude by talking about how, if at all, can we fix this problem? How can we reduce racial bias in our everyday lives? You might remember about 2 years ago, there was an incident in a Philadelphia Starbucks that was a really timely demonstration of racial bias when I was teaching this class 2 years ago. What happened was essentially there were two black men in a Starbucks doing absolutely nothing, just minding their own business. And one of the Starbucks employees actually called the police on them because they hadn't ordered anything. They were just sitting there waiting for a friend to show up. And I guess the employee interpreted this as being somehow suspicious. This blew up on social media and in the news. If you're curious, there's a woman who was actually in the Starbucks when this happened, took a cell phone video, and there's a link to her Twitter account right here where you can see actually some of this unfolding. But it was a pretty outrageous thing to have happened for just these men who were doing absolutely nothing to get the police called on them. So it raised an interesting conversation about racial bias and particularly implicit bias, which we'll talk about in just a minute, in the United States and whether and how we can actually do anything to address this problem. Now, I had you read an article for today called "The Science of Your Racist Brain" because I think this article does a pretty good job of talking in general terms about the psychology of bias, not just racial bias, but all sorts of prejudices and biases. So this article covers a lot of ground. It talks about a lot of things that we're going to talk about in more detail today. Things like the implicit association test, the effects of stereotypes, in-group biases, biases among medical professionals, and it even talks to some degree about the neurological basis for bias and prejudice. So the implication of this article is that yes, explicit bias exists, right? There are certainly people who are knowingly and outwardly prejudiced against folks, particularly people of color. But there are also implicit biases, which we all, frankly, demonstrate to some degree, and that's what the psychological research suggests, is that even people who do not show or endorse explicit prejudice sometimes harbor, or more often than not, harbor unconscious biases that we aren't even aware of. That might influence our behavior in ways that we don't even recognize and can't even necessarily control, but that psychologists are able to detect when we're running carefully controlled laboratory experiments. And the article kind of makes the argument that these biases, these implicit biases, are kind of a byproduct of how our brain works. That it's something that is very difficult to overcome, not something that we can just flip off like a light switch. It's something that happens automatically, and it's sort of ingrained in us. And as the authors explain, part of this comes from our natural tendency to think of the world in black and white terms. And I don't mean that in a racial sense. I mean that in a sense of in-groups and out-groups. The world is a very complicated place, right? And if we had to pay attention to every single detail of our everyday lives, that would be very overwhelming in terms of the amount of information we have to process. So generally speaking, what the brain does is it tries to simplify the world around us and detect patterns and categorize things that allow us to allow our brains to process information more efficiently. Now, usually this is a very adaptive thing for our brains to do, right? It allows us to navigate our environment faster without getting bogged down in every single little detail. But in many cases, that tendency can also backfire and lead us to maybe see things that aren't really there, maybe form, stereotypes, for example, about groups that are overgeneralizations, and not, frankly, rooted in reality. And in fact, there's been a lot of research on this throughout the history of psychology, that people naturally tend to categorize other people into in groups and out groups. In groups meaning us, people like me, whereas out groups are them, people who are not like me. And that could be based on any characteristic. It could be based on gender, sex, race, socioeconomic status, even something like what sports team you're a fan of, your line of work. People naturally think this way. They naturally think in terms of us versus them. And in fact, there's a theory in social psychology called social identity theory, which says that people's tendency to categorize people into in groups and out groups is so strong that we do it even when those groups are completely arbitrary. So in one study, for example, they brought people into the laboratory and they showed them a screen with a whole bunch of dots on it. So imagine a PowerPoint slide with just a whole bunch of dots, and they showed it to them for a couple seconds, and then they had them estimate how many dots there were on the graph. And they arbitrarily told people that they either overestimated or underestimated the number of dots that were on the slide. So they created these two groups that were completely arbitrary, right? It wasn't even accurate feedback. They just randomly told people, oh, you guessed too many or too few dots. And then later in that same study, those participants had the opportunity to award money to other people who were participating in the study. And the only information they had about these people was whether those other people were also overestimators or underestimators. And what they found is that when people were given the opportunity to award money to other people, they actually gave more money to people who allegedly did the same thing that they did. So if I was told that I was an overestimator, that I said there were more dots than there actually were, I actually formed a prejudice against underestimators, and then when given the opportunity to award people money, I gave more money to fellow overestimators. This is obviously a really, tenuous way of creating groups, but the tendency for people to think in terms of us versus them is so strong that even when you create what they called minimal groups, this is, something that people do. They immediately start to show prejudice against people who are different from them. In a follow-up study, they did something similar. So just to clarify, this is called the minimal groups paradigm. You probably saw that on the slide. Made famous by a psychologist named Henry Tajfel in the early 1970s. In another study, they had people look at paintings and rate how much they liked these paintings. And at the end of the study, again, people were arbitrarily told that they preferred the paintings of an artist named Klee versus an artist named Kandinsky. And they found the same effect. So if I was told that I liked Klee's paintings better, I would award more money to other people who also liked Klee's paintings better, and form a prejudice against people who liked Kandinsky's paintings better. So the point is, even when these groups are really, really, not meaningful in any way, even when they're completely arbitrary, people tend to favor those who are like them and denigrate and discriminate against people who are not like them. So outside of the laboratory, how might these biases influence people's behavior? I've picked out some instances of this, some not so serious, some very serious. Examples of racial bias influencing real-world behavior. For example, baseball umpires. There's an analysis of baseball umpires found that they tend to call more strikes when the pitcher is of their same race. And this is true for, white umpires with white pitchers, black umpires with black pitchers, Latinx umpires with Latinx pitchers. If there is, congruence between the race of the umpire and the pitcher, it turns out the umpire tends to call more strikes. Now, it's a very small effect, right? You can probably see from the article here, it says it happens about 1% of the time, but that works out to about one pitch per baseball game, which could make a big difference if that pitch comes at a very critical time in the game. This is kind of interesting. So right around the time that that whole Starbucks scandal broke that I talked about on the first slide, a lot of attention was brought to this issue and a lot of research was done on it. And in one particular study, researchers did something that I think is pretty clever. They emailed a bunch of hotels asking for local restaurant recommendations. And some of the people presented themselves as a racial minority, and some people presented themselves as white. And they wanted to see whether the responses that they got from the concierge at the hotel differed as a function of what race they told the hotel that they were. So people who emailed and had stereotypically black or Asian names were actually less likely to get any response at all. So they email a hotel asking for restaurant recommendations, and right off the bat, they were more likely to be just completely ignored. The researchers also counted the number of recommendations that they got, and non-white individuals got 20% fewer restaurant recommendations. So again, some indication here that the hotel employees were being more friendly to the white individuals. They were less likely to be called by their name. So again, an indication of friendliness, right? Usually calling someone by their name is a friendly gesture. It kind of indicates warmth and closeness. The replies were less likely to be personal in that regard when the person emailing was a person of color. They were less likely to get a complimentary sign-off to their email. So at the end of the email, the researchers looked at, well, how was it signed? And white individuals were more likely to get a response that concluded with the word like best or best wishes or sincerely, whereas for black and Asian individuals, the email just stopped. And white individuals often got more information than they even asked for. So if they asked for restaurant recommendations, sometimes they also got, other recommendations that they didn't request. Whereas with the black and Asian individuals, the hotels limited their recommendations and didn't go, were less likely to go above and beyond, so to speak, for the black and Asian individuals. Now, this is, I think, a pretty clever study, and B, it clearly shows the effects of prejudice here, right? The same email from a person who is ostensibly of a different race was either less likely to get any reply or got a reply that was less friendly and less helpful. The one caveat here, which is kind of interesting, is if in the email the person made it clear that they were planning to actually stay at the hotel, so they were therefore not just a random person emailing, but they were a prospective customer, a prospective hotel guest, the magnitude of the racial bias became less. So it looks like, being a patron of the hotel actually did protect to some degree, not completely, but to some degree, against these biased responses. What about doctors? So now we're getting into the more serious consequences of racial bias. Would a doctor treat a white and black patient differently if those patients were experiencing the same symptoms? As it turns out, there is some evidence that the answer is yes. So in one study, for example, both white and black patients were presented as having bone fractures, and doctors were asked whether they would give painkillers, analgesics, to these patients. And what they found is that there was a racial bias there. 74% of white patients with bone fractures were given painkillers, whereas only 57% of black patients with bone fractures were given painkillers. So white and black adults with the same condition were treated differently by doctors. Sadly, this also seems to extend to kids. So here's another study of children with appendicitis and whether they were given painkillers for their appendicitis. As you can see here, black kids were considerably less likely than white kids to get painkillers when they had symptoms of appendicitis. So for whatever reason, black patients showing the same symptoms as white patients, there are several studies showing that they're less likely to be given painkillers by medical professionals. Now, there are a number of reasons why this might happen, but there's one I think that is particularly alarming, which is the possibility that doctors might actually have inaccurate beliefs about biological differences between black and white individuals. In fact, there's a study that came out a few years ago that produced some pretty alarming data to this effect. So in 2016, these researchers surveyed a whole bunch of white medical students about potential biological differences between white and black individuals. Now, these beliefs aren't true, right? There are not reliable biological differences between black and white individuals, anatomy or physiology. But in this study, they actually found that 50%, half of white medical students, held false beliefs about biological differences between white and black patients. So, you can see, especially some of the ones that with asterisks here, a substantial percentage of medical students believe that blacks have denser and stronger bones than whites. That white individuals are less likely to have strokes, that they're less susceptible to heart disease. These beliefs just aren't true. So that's very alarming if these myths about biological differences are actually present not only in the general population but also among trained medical professionals. You can imagine how that would impact their treatment of black and white patients so that they would treat them differently. So, we're going to come back to the question of how to fix bias, how to address it later today, but one of the articles that you read talks specifically about how to reduce bias among medical professionals. And an interesting study here, they collected data over the course of 6 years, and they found that medical schools, medical programs that fostered respect for cultural differences actually produced graduates that showed less racial bias. But what I think is really interesting about this is it wasn't training per se. It was more about the culture of the medical program itself. Because they also found that receiving diversity training actually had no effect on medical students' racial attitudes and implicit or explicit bias. We're going to come back to that point a little later, talking about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of anti-bias training. But what this suggests is that in order to combat racial bias in medical settings, you really need to create a culture that is supportive and embraces and values diversity. It can't seem artificial. It can't seem forced. It can't be a training that's imposed on people. It has to be just kind of deeply ingrained into the spirit of the program itself, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Certainly a worthwhile thing to do, but not always easy. You may be wondering, in that study that we just reviewed on the last slide, how did they measure implicit bias? How can you measure something that happens subconsciously that we aren't even aware of? Researchers in the 1990s developed a method for measuring implicit bias called the implicit association test. And before we go any further, I'd like you to pause the lecture here, click this link. It will take you to a page where you can complete the racial implicit association test. So I'd like you to do this so you can get a sense of how the test actually works. And it will also tell you a little something about your results, which you may or may not find surprising. And then after you complete the test, we will talk about how the test actually works and we'll talk about some criticisms of this test. So go ahead and pause your lecture now, complete the test, and then we will resume. Okay, so you now have an idea of how this test works. Just to recap, you'll be given a task where you have to press one of two keys on your keyboard, depending on whether the face or word that appears on the screen is either white or bad, black or good, and then halfway through the test, those words switch. So that white and good would be on the same side, black and bad would be on the same side. And long story short, what the research tends to show is that people are slower to respond when black and good are on the same side of the screen. The assumption being that people have a harder time connecting black with good than they do connecting white with good. Now, you got a sense of your own results from doing this, whether you put a whole lot of faith in them or not. But it probably comes as no surprise to you that this is a very controversial way of measuring implicit bias. There are people who believe that this is a very good way of measuring bias. There are people who believe that this is a useless way of measuring bias. So I'll be very curious to get your thoughts and your reactions, not only to your own performance, but also your just thoughts in general about whether you think this is an effective way of measuring bias or not. I mean, the people who support the use of the IAT argue that people's scores on the IAT, and this is true, do actually predict meaningful things, right? So clearly this test is producing information that is telling us something. But the question is, what exactly is it telling us? Is it telling us about the degree to which the individual taking the test is personally biased? Or is it telling us about the degree to which they are aware of stereotypes? So that's an important distinction, and a common criticism of this test is if you took this test and let's say you showed a strong preference for white individuals, does that mean that you personally have a strong preference for white individuals? Or does it mean that you are aware of the fact that the society in general shows a preference to white individuals, but you may not necessarily hold that preference yourself? So it's a very, very controversial, and it has been for the last 25 years. I want to show you a quick video that talks a little more about the implicit association test, including interviews with the researchers who actually created it, and some interviews and scenes showing people taking it and reacting to their results. This is a very popular test. It's available online. I haven't updated this figure, so it's probably even more than that now, but it's been taken about 20 million times around the world, just the test that you just did. So go ahead and pause and watch this brief video. Here's watch from 3:45 to 7:13, about 3.5 minutes, and then we will come back together. So the last bit of that video, I think, is pretty powerful. It probably comes as not a huge surprise that a significant majority of white folks who take this test show a preference for whites, meaning they respond faster when white is paired with good than when black is paired with good. But even about half of black individuals who take this test also show a preference for whites, which in the view of the researchers indicates the fact that many black individuals actually have internalized the anti-black biases that society holds. And we'll see some more, even more alarming examples of that later today in the context of criminal justice specifically. But, there is certainly evidence that black folks, even from a very young age, internalize anti-black attitudes in a very, problematic and frankly disturbing way. This research goes all the way back to the 1930s and 1940s. showing that, black individuals sometimes hold prejudices against their own groups, that against other black individuals. And that starts early in life. So the video that I'm about to ask you to watch talks about a series of studies called the Clark doll studies, carried out by two black researchers, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, in the 1930s and 1940s. And these were really groundbreaking studies that actually played a significant role in the Brown versus Board of Education case in the 1950s, which is a very important case in terms of desegregating public schools for black and white children. So go ahead and pause right now and watch this video about the Clark doll experiment, and then we will come back together and talk about it. Oops, so I just realized I've had this recording that whole time. I thought I had it paused, sorry. So what you saw in that video is that, geez, sorry about that. Even from a very young age, black children showing preferences for the white doll. And what the studies showed is that black kids showed a even stronger preference for the white doll if they were attending a segregated school. So the Supreme Court saw this as really powerful evidence that attending a segregated school was actually proving to be really harmful to black kids' self-image and self-esteem, that they actually were internalizing these societal perceptions of white as good and black as bad. And that was influential in their decision to desegregate public schools in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. Okay, now shifting gears to talking about the criminal justice system specifically. We've talked about the effects of racial bias. We've talked about how it can influence medical professionals, baseball umpires, hotel employees, Starbucks employees, and we've started to talk about the fact that even black individuals might hold subconscious prejudices that they internalize from society in a very problematic way. Now, with respect to the U.S. population, only about 13% of the U.S. population is black. But what's really troublesome is if you look at the percentage of people that are killed by police, about 31% of people killed by police are black. So they are black individuals are very highly overrepresented among people who are killed at the hands of a police officer. Even more troubling, about 47%, almost half of exonerees are black. Just let that sink in for a second. Only 13% of the U.S. population is black, yet about half of the wrongful convictions that we know of are wrongful convictions of black individuals. Clearly, for whatever reason, or more likely for a whole myriad of reasons, black individuals are more likely to be wrongly convicted of a crime that they didn't commit. To give you one example, following up from the previous lecture on forensic science and bias in forensic science, I wanted to quickly tell you about a study where they investigated whether racial bias could impact judgments of forensic evidence. So in this particular study, they gave people two fingerprints to compare. One fingerprint that was taken from the crime scene and another fingerprint that was taken from a suspect. And some of the people in this study were told that the crime being investigated was a child molestation case, and others were told that the crime being investigated was an identity theft. And on top of that, some of the people in this study were told that the suspect was a white man, and others were told that the suspect was an Asian woman. Now, the reason that they did this is because child molestation is a crime that is stereotypically committed by white men and not stereotypically committed by Asian women. So the goal of the study was to see whether if you told a person that the suspect was a white man and that the crime was child molestation, would they be more likely to believe that the fingerprints matched when in fact they did not? And that's exactly what they found. So when people were told that it was an identity theft case, the race and sex of the suspect made no difference, right? They were equally likely, as you can see from these two bars over here, they were equally likely to believe that the fingerprints matched. But when people were told that the crime was a child molestation, they were considerably more likely to believe that the fingerprints matched if they were told that the suspect was a white man, presumably because the racial and gender characteristics of the suspect matched the stereotype associated with the crime. So the implication here is that if you tell forensic examiners about the race or gender of a suspect, stereotypes about who tends to commit particular crimes could influence their judgment of the forensic evidence, such that they might look at the same evidence and come away with an entirely different conclusion, one that is influenced by their stereotypes. I think the most important article I think that we read for this week is the Summers and Murata piece, which really gives a very comprehensive overview of the many ways in which black individuals are disadvantaged at every step of the way in the criminal justice process. So they talk about stop and frisk, which obviously has been in the news quite a bit lately with Bloomberg and whatnot. It's no secret that was a highly racially biased policy, that black and Hispanic individuals were stopped and frisked at much higher rates than white individuals were. Black individuals are also more likely to experience use of force at the hands of police officers, things like tasing and whatnot. Once they're arrested and charged, they're disadvantaged in the courtroom as well. Black individuals tend to get harsher charges, harsher plea deals. Black juveniles are more likely to be charged as adults than white juveniles are, and they're more likely to be denied bail or given a higher bail amount by a judge. So again, pervasive racial biases in the courtroom throughout the trial process. And then at the trial itself, black individuals are more likely to be convicted of the same crime compared to a white individual. That's especially true if the victim is white. They receive harsher sentences than white individuals for the same crime. And when black individuals are victims of crime, they actually get less sympathy from juries than white individuals. So in other words, the same crime tends to be perceived as somehow worse if the victim is white than if the victim is black. So this is, there are a lot of problems here from start to finish, from arrest to trial to conviction. I mean, there are some serious problems here. The nice thing about this article is they don't just point out the many problems that exist. They also suggest some somewhat feasible solutions for addressing these problems. So, for example, Summers and Murata talk about the fact that police tend to show stronger racial biases when they're tired. So they talk about, well, maybe we should reconsider how we schedule police officers' shifts to make sure that they're not fatigued, in the hopes that, the fact that they won't be as tired will make them less biased. I think, to me, one of the most important suggestions they make is to increase the diversity of the police force. In other words, make sure that people of color are represented on the police force, so that it doesn't come across as white police policing colored communities. I think I'm not a criminologist by any means, but I know there is a I don't know what you'd call it, a theory called community policing, Some of you may know more about this than I do, even. So if you do know about that, chime in. But my understanding of it is that a key goal of making sure that the police and the citizens who they're working for have a positive relationship is to make sure that the racial diversity of the police force matches the racial diversity of their citizens. So in other words, you don't want an all-white police force policing an all-black neighborhood. That's problematic for a lot of reasons, right? People tend to be more trusting of police, and I think police tend to be more, you know, have more harmonious relationships with civilians if there is some dialogue and some congruence between their backgrounds. They do talk about bias training, which again we're going to come back to later today, but they propose actual mandated bias training as a way of potentially combating bias, and they also talk about efforts to increase the diversity of juries. So going back to what we talked about last week in terms of voir dire and jury selection, they actually talk about the possibility of eliminating peremptory challenges altogether. So last week we talked about how peremptory challenges can often be used in a racially biased way, which is true. They talk about, well, maybe we just shouldn't have them at all. Maybe we should just do away with those altogether. Go ahead and pause and watch this short YouTube video where they show the Baltimore City Police actually doing some of these trainings with civilians, and you'll hear the civilians talk about their experience with it. All right, welcome back. Pretty cool, right? I mean, it's clearly a very sophisticated, immersive training, and it's clearly very, very difficult, right? It's meant to simulate what it's like to actually be on the job and put you in that situation and make you make some very difficult but very quick decisions. I think this is a cool initiative for Baltimore City Police to be doing, because it both increases transparency about how officers are being trained, and it sort of fosters a good relationship between the public and the police, and also shows gives the public a little taste of what it's like to be a police officer. So if you ever have the opportunity to do this, I'd very much encourage you to check it out. I think they used to do these once a month. Obviously that's probably not happening right now, but if I hear about it, I'll be sure to let everybody know. Now, that training was used in the study you read today by Carell and others, published in 2002. It was actually a series of 4 experiments that were inspired by the killing of Amadou Diallo, which is the man you see pictured here on the New York Post. Amadou Diallo was a man who was killed in New York City, and he was, long story short, he was unarmed. He was shot 41 times by police who believed that he was armed, but later he was unarmed. So you can think of this case as being sort of the original Trayvon Martin, the original Tamir Rice, the original. I mean, the list goes on and on. Eric Garner and Walter Scott and Philando Castile. I mean, there's so many of these. But Amadou Diallo was actually one of the first instances of an innocent, unarmed black man being killed at the hands of police officers. So the goal of this study, generally speaking, was to see how police make decisions in this this simulated shoot don't shoot training environment. So here's a table from the that summarizes the first 2 studies, and I won't go into detail, but in a nutshell, what it shows is that when the target, meaning the person on the screen, was black, police took longer to decide not to shoot unarmed black targets, and they shot armed black targets faster. So you can probably see how this kind of parallels with the implicit association test, right? When a black target had a weapon, people reacted more quickly. When a black target didn't have a weapon, people reacted more slowly. And what's particularly worrisome about this is that people made more false alarms for black targets, meaning they were more likely to shoot unarmed black targets than they were to shoot unarmed white targets. This is obviously very alarming and not an easy problem to fix, right? Because this is split-second decision making, but a very, very consequential decision as well. In the third study, they wanted to look for other factors that might predict a person's bias against black targets. So they measured a whole bunch of things, and they found some interesting trends here. So first, they found that people who were more knowledgeable about stereotypes showed stronger shooter bias. They also found that interracial contact was also predictive of shooter bias. But interestingly, people's own personal prejudices were not predictive of shooter bias. So again, it kind of goes back to talking about the implicit association test, right? Does it measure your personal prejudice, or does it measure your awareness of societal prejudice? In this particular study, your personal prejudice didn't predict your behavior in the shooting task, but your knowledge of societal prejudice did predict your behavior. And then in study 4, again, kind of dovetailing with the implicit association test, they ran the same study with black participants, and they found the same levels of bias. So even black shooters were showing biases against black targets. Again, suggesting that even black individuals, unconsciously internalize some of the negative views that society holds about their own in-group. So how do we solve this problem? Can we train people to be unbiased? Does bias training work? Starbucks seemed to think so. So about a month after the incident that I opened this video with in May 2018, you probably remember this, Starbucks shut down for a day so that all of its employees could engage in diversity training. However, the research on diversity training presents a very pessimistic picture about it. So as you can see from this excerpt from this article, this Vox article here, lots of big companies, lots of Fortune 500 companies include diversity training for their employees. However, the research suggests that it doesn't really work all that well, that the effects of it don't last long. So there may be positive effects in the short term. Here they say, a day or two, but you're not fundamentally changing how people think or how people see the world. And what's worse, there's actually some evidence that forcing people to participate in diversity training could actually backfire, right? That it activates people's stereotypes. So imagine a person who's kind of resistant to the idea of participating in this training. They might actually become resentful of having to do it, which might actually have the opposite of the intended effect. It might make their prejudices more salient and cause them to actually act on them more than they otherwise would have. So one potential problem with these trainings is that they may not work at all and have no effect. A second potential problem is that they may actually make bias worse. So they may actually increase bias, especially among people who are being forced to do this and are resentful of that. And a third potential problem, which was raised in the Marshall Project article that you read for today, is it may actually lead people to overcorrect for the biases. So if you may actually walk away from this training with just a different bias than the bias that you had before, if you try to correct the bias, but you sort of overdo it, so to speak. Hopefully you had I don't have a link to it here, but hopefully you had a chance to watch at least a little bit of the video that was included on the Marshall Project webpage that includes the jury instructions that are given to juries. In light of what we talked about last week with voir dire, and how a big part of voir dire is trying to figure out who will be biased and who will be unbiased. But now that we know that implicit bias is something that we aren't even aware of, it raises some interesting questions about is this going to work or not? I think the district court in this article should be commended for at least trying to address this issue, but who knows if it actually works? Who knows what effect it has? To my knowledge, there's been no research to actually test whether this video has desirable effects, undesirable effects, or neither. So I'll be curious to get your own thoughts on that. Whether this video is good, bad, or neither. Maybe it's just completely useless. With a psychologist named Gordon Allport. And what Allport hypothesized is that contact between groups reduces prejudice. So here you have a picture of Jackie Robinson and 3 white teammates. They because they were interacting with each other as teammates on the same team, they started to see each other as baseball players rather than as white and black, right? They were all members of the same team. So even though Jackie Robinson was of a different racial group, he was a member of their in-group in the sense that he was a Dodger, and they were also Dodgers. However, it's overly simplistic to say that merely putting white and black people in the same room is going to reduce prejudice, right? There are actually certain conditions that need to be met, which I'm going to explain. Because under some circumstances, encouraging intergroup contact could actually make matters worse. Let me show you a few maps that kind of get to that point. So this is a map from 2010, which is still fairly accurate, showing for each state what percentage of the population identifies as black. So the darker blue states have a higher percentage of black residents, and the lighter blue states have a lower percentage of black residents. On the I'm gonna hit the button in a second. I'm gonna show you another graph, which is gonna show you for each state the average score on the implicit association test. In other words, how biased are the people? How racially biased, according to the IAT, are people in that state? Check this map out. So the redder states are the states where there is a stronger anti-black bias on the implicit association test. And the bluer states show a weaker black bias, or anti-black bias, rather. There's a pretty clear pattern here, right? The states that have a larger black population also show higher anti-black attitudes or stronger anti-black attitudes on the implicit association test. So what's going on here? How do we explain this? If intergroup contact is supposed to decrease prejudice, we should see the opposite pattern, right? We should see less prejudice in states with larger black population, because presumably those states would provide more opportunities for intergroup contact. But here we see the opposite. We see that states with more black individuals are actually showing higher levels of bias. So what's going on here? There could be any number of explanations for this. One possibility is that while there is more contact between groups, there's also more competition between groups, right? So maybe in places that are more diverse, there's greater competition between the white and black population, or greater segregation maybe, that sort of reinforces these prejudices and stereotypes. A second possibility, and these are not mutually exclusive, and I'm sure there are others, a second possibility is that increased intergroup contact actually presents more opportunities for white individuals to engage in confirmation bias. So they tend to, for example, maybe they tend to notice more often when they encounter a non-white individual who fits with a stereotype that they have about that group. So it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you're viewing the world through a lens of stereotypes and prejudice, being surrounded by non-white individuals provides you with a lot of opportunities to quote unquote confirm those inaccurate stereotypes. So again, going back to the contact hypothesis, Gordon Allport outlined conditions that need to be met in order for contact to work. So first, contact between groups reduces prejudice only if those groups have equal status. That's an important one, right? So simply putting white and black employees in the same company will not reduce prejudice unless those white and black employees are equals. Second, they can't just be around each other. They have to actually interact with each other, and they have to have pleasant interactions with each other, right? This point came up a little bit in the article about interracial contact and bias among doctors. That the interactions with other individuals of other races, they have to be favorable. I forget the exact term they use, but they have to be positive interactions. Third, the contact hypothesis works best when members of different racial groups are working together to achieve superordinate goals, meaning they have the same goal that they're working toward. Again, think of Jackie Robinson playing for the Dodgers, right? They're working on the same team. They have the same goal, which is to win baseball games. Having that shared goal creates a sense of unity among these people that otherwise are somewhat different. Now they're all playing, literally and metaphorically playing for the same team. Fourth, and I think this is a particularly important one, exposure to counter stereotypic examples of individuals. So if you hold a stereotype about some group, it is often very jarring to that stereotype to encounter an individual from that group who does not fit with that stereotype, right? So if I have a stereotype, for example, that all Yankees fans love Chinese food. I'm just making this up off the top of my head. All Yankees fans love Chinese food. If I encounter a Yankees fan who doesn't like Chinese food, that doesn't fit with my stereotype, right? So I'm forced to revisit my stereotype, which actually is going to have the effect of weakening it. Now, this is something that people will have a difficult time doing on their own because people usually don't seek out those opportunities to disprove their stereotypes, right? Think back to confirmation bias from the other week. Now, I want to circle back to wrap things up. This is the last slide, but just to wrap things up, I want to circle back to Starbucks. So on the very first slide today, we talked about the incident at Starbucks, which was unfortunate and just embarrassing, and we talked about Starbucks' response to it, which I think you could argue is equally unfortunate, right? They shut down Starbucks for a day. They had their employees participate in diversity training, and they kind of said, okay, well that should fix it. But unfortunately, the research suggests that isn't the case, right? So now that we know what we know about the contact hypothesis, what could Starbucks actually do that would work, right? What could Starbucks actually do? The contact hypothesis implies that first, one thing that Starbucks could do to actually reduce racial prejudice among their staff is make sure that their workforce is diverse, right? Have a staff that is diverse and make sure that they have equal status. We don't want to create a situation where we have all white managers and all black employees, for example. We want the members to have equal status. We want them to interact, meaning put them on the same shift, right? Make sure they work together. Make sure they're working toward the same goal, working on the same team. And something they could also do, getting down to this last bullet point here, is put more people of color in leadership positions. You know, those could serve as important counter stereotypic examples for individuals to come into Starbucks and see, oh, this Starbucks has a black manager. That's important in weakening people's stereotypes and ultimately decreasing their prejudice and discrimination. But forcing people to sit in a room and sit through a diversity training when a lot of them are going to be resistant to it in the first place, at best is going to have no effect, and at worst seems like it could actually exacerbate the biases. So again, kind of getting back to the article about doctors, it's not an easy solution. It's not a matter of, well, we're going to have people do this training and that should fix it. The evidence consistently shows that training doesn't work. What really is required is a fundamental change to the culture. Fostering a culture of equality and respect, equal status, positive interactions, shared, superordinate goals, and even beyond that, making sure that people of color are represented at all levels of the organization. Everybody from the barista to the management to every single step of the way. It's not easy, but it's important, and it shows that the complex problem requires a complex solution. In the criminal justice system, we've seen some similar measures, but sadly progress hasn't been great. And we're actually we'll come back slightly to the topic of racial bias next week when we talk about racial bias in the administration of the death penalty. So we're not quite done talking about bias just yet, but I look forward to getting your thoughts on it, and I'll see you in the next video when we talk about capital punishment.